Hi guys, thank you for coming. So I want to start off by telling you guys a story about something that happened to me a couple years ago when I was interviewing. So I'm interviewing for this test engineering position, and I'm sitting in the interview and everything's going really great, and I'm answering all the questions correctly and I feel really good. And then the interviewer turned to me and he said, "Do you have any questions? Like now's your time to ask whatever you want." So I said, "Okay. Who's responsible for your testing environment, and how often do you dump production data to staging, and like what's that whole process like?" And the interviewer stopped me and said, "They don't have a staging environment, they test in production." Come again? I was so confused. I didn't understand that people did this. I had never heard of the topic before, and imagine hearing about this like in your interview about this weird thing that this company does. So I was shocked. I was so confused. So then the interviewer asked me to do something, and I want you guys to do it with me today. So I want everyone to think about the last feature that your team deployed. Okay, you got it? You're thinking about it? Is it working? Right now? Yeah. In production? Yeah. How do you know? Your users haven't reported anything to you, like you haven't gotten paged, so you assume that it works, right? But you don't know. Testing in production is the only way to know that your features are working right now in production. Okay, so let's define what testing in production is. It means testing your features in the environments that your features will live in. It means not using a dummy environment like staging or a QA environment. It means testing your features where your users will interact with those features, will use those features. And what is it not? It's not a replacement for all testing. And most importantly, it's not the end of the world. So hi guys, I'm Talia. I'm a software engineer in test, or SDET, or QA engineer, or quality engineer. This position has a million titles. I don't know why. I'm the founder of Women Who Test Tel Aviv. So it's a community group that's in Tel Aviv for engineers, women engineers who are interested in testing. I'm a testing in prod skeptic to practitioner. So I used to not know what testing in production is, and now I practice it. I do a lot of fun things at work. I really like my job, but my favorite thing that I do at work is testing my coworkers. And what do I mean by testing my coworkers? I test their reactions to things that I think are funny, when it's their birthday, when they're on vacation. Anyone here a Warriors fan? No, we're really far from California, I know. Okay, so after the interview, I went home and I did some homework. So why have I never heard about testing in production? And if it's such a great thing, why aren't more companies implementing it? So in my experience, before I interviewed at this company, all the companies that I'd worked for before, they have a staging environment. They test in a test environment, and then once it's fully tested, then you deploy to production. And that's like the norm for me. That was the norm for me. Does anyone here use a staging environment for testing? I'm sure most of you. Okay, great. Now keep your hand up if your staging environment is perfect, absolutely perfect. There's nothing wrong with it. It's an exact replica of production. That's what I thought.
No, it is.
I don't believe you, but we'll talk later.
All right.
So testing environments really are just not an ideal place for testing your code, and we're going to go through why. So what's wrong with staging environments, with test environments? Why are they bad to use? Staging environments are expensive to maintain, right? So companies spend millions and millions of dollars every year to create and maintain their staging environments, and it's really not necessary. Okay, staging test results do not always match production test results. So I want you guys to think about a time. Are there any testers in here? Anyone who tests their code? I'm assuming it's like a lot of you. Great. Yeah. Okay, so think about a time where you tested your feature in and out. You went through every requirement. You worked with a product owner. You understand how the feature is supposed to work. You tested in staging, and it works perfectly well. It's perfect. You feel so good about this. And then you deploy the code to production, and what happens? There's a bug. So the data in staging doesn't match the data in production, therefore the test results won't always match. So production includes data that staging doesn't have. So there's differences between your production environment and your staging environment, and you're not going to know what those differences are until you test in both places. And no one cares if staging is broken. So think about a time where you have a really high priority issue and you're working on it to fix it or to test it, and you log into staging, but you get the 404 screen of death, and you ping the person in charge, the IT guy, and he tells you he's at his lunch break, so you have to ping someone else who's in a different time zone, and then you ping them, and they say you have to open a ticket, and then the ticket has to be escalated by your manager. No one cares if staging is broken. No one's going to get a call in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner because staging is down. No one cares. Okay, so the load in staging does not match the load in production. So when you think of all the people who use your feature, who use your product in production, and all the people who use them in staging, that number should be really, really different, assuming your product is successful and you have users. But the load in staging doesn't match the load in production. So you can't get any production performance data from staging. That's two completely different environments. And at the end of the day, I've never heard anyone speak highly of their staging environment, except for you. But I know what you're thinking. That's nice, Talia. Testing in production sounds great, but I can't do it. I have to deal with my staging environment, and that's that. So I used to think this too. But the good news is that you already do this. So what's the first thing you do right after you deploy a feature? Right, you go to production and you test it, right? Okay, so here's the thing. Testing in production only works when the whole team owns product quality. So everyone from designers to product to test engineers to full stack engineers, everyone on the team owns product quality. So contrary to popular belief, it's not the test engineer's job to ensure the quality of the whole product. Testing in production only works when you test early and often. It's really important. We're going to talk about this later about having your tests run incrementally, because that feedback of knowing that your tests are working in production is really important, because if there's anything wrong, if there's any bugs or defects, you're going to find them fast, and then you can fix them fast and provide a better user experience throughout the entire user flow. Testing in production only works when you trust your team and your product. So I learned that what stops most companies from testing in production is fear. They're too afraid of the risks, and they don't have trust in their systems. So think about it. Companies don't test in production because of fear and lack of trust in their systems, and for the same reason, they refuse to engage in the tools and process changes that will generate that trust. But I know it's risky. I know there are risks to this process. So what are some of the risks, some of the things that you guys thought when you first came in and you saw, testing in production? I'm assuming that it had something to do with it can affect real end users, right? Like if your bots or your users are performing things in production and it interacts with a real user by accident, that could be a problem. You don't want that interaction. You want those two entities, your test entities and your real entities, to be completely separate. It can affect reporting and analytics. So whenever you click on something, do something in your UI, it's logged somewhere. And then based off of all the data that you get from your product, your C-levels or your management, they make business decisions off of what you're doing in production. So you don't want to make any business decisions based off of what your bots are doing, right? Just off of what real users are doing. It can affect third parties that your software is integrated with. So if you have like an email confirmation that like sends an email to a specific person at the end of your flow, like if you're testing in production, you don't want a real person to get this email because it could cause confusion, something could go wrong. So with any third parties, you have to be really careful. So we're going to address all these risks, and I'm going to show you guys how to set up testing in production, what the tools are that you need. We're going to address the risks, and we're going to set this up together because I know that you're dying to know. Okay, So the first step when you're testing in production is to install all the necessary tools. You can't do anything if you don't have the right tools. And the first tool that is really at the core of testing in production, and the first tool that you really need is called feature flagging. And feature flagging is a way to hide, enable, or disable features at runtime. So you can decide who sees which features, and I'm going to go through that in a little bit. So this is kind of how I picture feature flagging in my head. And here's what we did. So each feature would be written by our developers and launched into a feature flag. And you can think of a feature flag as a bubble. So only the people who are targeted in that feature flag can see anything related to that feature. So if you look up here, these green people, they can't see anything related to this feature flag because they're not targeted. Their names are not inside of the bucket of like the people who are allowed to interact and see this feature. Okay? So these people don't see anything related to this feature. So the feature flag would stay off until we went in and did all of our testing. So while the feature flag was off, we as test engineers went in, we tested all the requirements, we tested all the right functionality. This is where we opened defects while the feature flag was off, and while we were the only ones who could access the feature. Once we finished testing everything, then we would turn the feature flag on. So if there was a bug or if something was wrong, we wouldn't have to worry because the people who are in the outside world, they can't see anything related to the feature. So if something's wrong with this feature, only we would see it, we would get alerted, we would know that something is wrong, but the outside world, they're not in that feature flag. They can't see that bug. That doesn't affect them. Okay, another thing we did was we created test users in production, and we targeted those users behind the feature flag for automation. And I'll go through this when I talk about automation in, when you're testing in production, but I just wanted to point it out here. Okay, so once we fixed all the bugs and we knew that everything was working while the feature flag was off, we would turn the feature flag on, already knowing 100% that our features are working in production and we didn't break anything that was existing. So at this point, the user can see the feature because the feature flag is on. This means that everyone can see the new feature now. So at this point, we already know that it's working, right? We didn't break anything. We're giving the best possible experience to our users now. And then we would repeat that process for every new feature. So each feature has its own feature flag, and this is kind of your release process. You have a feature for each feature flag. You test that feature in production with the feature flag off. Once you finish testing and everything's good with the feature flag off, you turn the feature flag on, already knowing that your feature is working. I feel like I just said feature like 600 times. Okay, so one of the questions that comes up a lot is, I have a really big company, I have a lot of features, I have a lot of things going on in my UI. If I put a feature flag in for everything, it's going to be an overload. I'm going to have way too many feature flags. It's going to be completely a mess, and I'm not going to be able to maintain it. So something that you have to do when you're working with feature flags is really keep your code base really clean and maintain your feature flags. So if you turned on a feature a month ago, 2 months ago, and it's working fine, you can delete that feature flag. So in order to avoid having a bunch of old feature flags, something that you can do is go through and make sure that the old ones are deleted. Another thing that is really important is when you're automating your flows, you want to make sure that you automate the core business flows. So you should work with your product owner to figure out what are the most important combinations of feature flags. Because if you have 20, 30 feature flags, it's kind of impossible to test every combination of every feature flag. So work with your product owner to figure out, to prioritize what's the best combination of feature flags to use. And like I said, the old code, the code that's not being used anymore, this can be deleted. You don't want old code that no one uses in your code base. So usually what we'll do is, like in our Jira task, we'll say, create the feature, turn on the feature flag as like subtasks, and then the feature won't be done until you delete the feature flag. Right, so you can delete the feature flag when you're done with it. I'm going to go through how to do this in Split. Split is one of the tools that I like to use for feature flagging, and the UI is really simple, really easy to use. So once you go on the Split homepage, you're going to see this button called Create Split. After you hit Create Split, you're going to figure out a name for your feature flag. So I'm going to call mine Really Cool Feature. And then you have to select a traffic type. So this is defining who's going to see your features before you turn it on for everyone to see. So you can distinguish between locations. So everyone who's in California can see and use this feature, but everyone else who's not in California cannot. For me, when I test, I like to make sure that I'm in the feature flag before so that I'm able to test and work through things. But sometimes product people like to be in the feature flag also. So when you're dealing with your traffic type, just make sure you work with your whole team so that everyone knows like only which people are going to be able to see the feature. So once you select your traffic type, you have to add specific targeting rules. So let's say your targeting rule was for users. You're going to go in and click Add Rules, and then you're going to select the users that are initially going to be targeted in that feature flag, right? So I don't know if you guys can see it. It's kind of small, but here the feature flag is going to be on for my test robot. It's going to be on for my developer, my designer, and me. So everyone on the team who is going to be interacting with the feature before it's released should be in this flag. And also one thing to note is that you can see that the feature flag here is off. So the default is off, but it's on for the people that you list specifically. Okay, and now in the code, I can say, if this really cool feature flag is on for this person, do something, and if it's not, do something else. So I specifically say the two different scenarios. And once the feature flag is once the feature flag is on, then you come back and you clean up this code. And then in the test, I can say, log in as that robot, because remember the robot was in the feature flag. Log in, do whatever action is supposed to be done for this feature, and then expect this really cool feature to work. So the script should be set up at the same time that the product is being developed. You should be working with your developers at the same time so that you don't have a bunch of features that don't have feature flags that need to be tested. So when you work with your developer, you want to make sure that you write the test at the same time that they are developing that feature. Does that make sense? You don't want your developers to finish the feature and then not have a test for it. When you're working with them, it makes it really easy to have things like data QA attributes and things that you can click on the elements with. Okay, so the best part about this, the cherry on top of the cake, was that when we turned on the feature flag in production, we already knew that our features were working. So there were no surprises. Okay, so the next tool you need after feature flagging is an automation framework because it's not scalable to manually test every feature in prod after you deploy it. So like I said before, you don't want to end up with a bunch of features that need to be tested before you deploy to production every time. So you want to make sure that at least your regression tests are all automated so that moving forward you don't have to test everything in production with every change manually. And the 4 things that I usually look for when I'm implementing a new automation framework, I want something that's easy to adopt. So if I'm teaching a developer how to write this test in production, I want them to easily be able to do it themselves. I want one that's easy to debug. So if something goes wrong, if a test fails, I want to know immediately what's going on. So some automation frameworks, it's really hard to figure out why the test failed, what's going on, and that troubleshooting time is really valuable when you're testing in production. So you want to make that that time to discover, time to solve the problem as small as possible. And you can do that if you have the right automation framework that's giving you the right information. You're also going to want to have one that has good reporting. So again, when a test fails, you need to know what happened, why did it happen, and good reporting is going to give that to you. You're also going to need one that has a good support community. So if you don't know how to do something in Puppeteer, you can go online to the Google Dev community and they can help you out. So whatever automation framework that you choose, you want to make sure that you have some sort of support community, especially when you're testing in production and things can go wrong and you need backup. Okay, so the next thing you need after an automation framework is a job scheduler. And a job scheduler is going to run your tests for you. And think of the longest time you'd want to know that a critical flow is failing. And that's what I would use for your increments. to run your tests. So basically, usually for when I'm scheduling jobs, I work with my product owner and I prioritize the tests. Which tests are the most important tests? What do I care about the most that I should run 2-3 times a day, 4 or 5 times a day, whatever. And then you can have another set of tests that are less critical tests, and you can say these less critical tests are going to run, once a day because I don't really this functionality isn't too important, but I need to make sure that it's working. And then you can have another set of tests that's your priority 1 tests that need to run all the time. So you can work with your product owner to figure out what the best way to split up your tests is. Okay, so why not just run the tests in a loop? When you're testing in production, it's risky. Why not just run them in a loop continuously? Number 1, it's overkill. You can also set up the tests if you don't want to run them incrementally. You can also set them up to run in your builds pipeline, so you don't have to worry with every new change that comes in. Another thing you should be doing is trusting your tests. So you don't need to run them in a loop if you know that they're working properly. So something that I like to do is I like to run my tests like 20 times on my machine in production and watch it run and make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to do. And after I have that confidence build up and I know that this test works, it's doing what it's supposed to do in production, then I'll push it up. It's kind of like a safety net that I have. Okay. So the next tool that you're going to want to have is an alerting tool. So remember when I talked about before, when you're testing in production, everyone on the team owns product quality. So when you set up your alerting tool, everyone on the team should be in this alerting process. So if a test fails, everyone on the team should know what to do. It shouldn't be one person's responsibility. It shouldn't be the test engineer's responsibility to fix every test every time something fails. You should also have a rotation of who's on call, and again, this should be with the whole team. Okay, so just to summarize, these are the tools that I've used when I've tested in production. For feature flagging, I've used Launch Darkly and Split. For automation, I've used Robot Framework, Puppeteer, and Protractor. For my job schedulers, I've used CircleCI and Jenkins. And for my alerting tools, I've used PagerDuty and Slack. So I'm sure there's more tools that work with this process, but these are the ones that I've used that I'm pretty comfortable with. Okay, so the next step after you have all of your tools set up is to create your test data. So the problem when you're creating test data in production is that you need a way to manipulate test data in production without affecting real end users, right? You don't want to affect any real end users. You don't want to affect any data or analytics. So one of the ways that we tackled this was to create a consistent naming convention for all test users. So you can say that any user with the string automation robot at a specific domain.com, we know that that's a test user. It has a flag that says that this is a test user. It's not a real user. These users acted like real people and they looked like real people on the site, but because they were named this way or they had a specific flag, we knew that they were test robots, that they were not real people. Another thing you can do is to have a Boolean set, and you can have it set to true for your test user. So like when a normal user goes to your site, they can be, this flag is test user would be default to false. And when you create test users for testing, then this flag will be true. So we also had a backend flagging system to identify our testing entities, so not just our test users. So when you think about your end-to-end flows for your company, you want to think about things like, what are the things that people can click on? Like, do I need to make a test version of this in production? How do I do that? You need some way to figure out how to flag your test entities so that when you're running your scripts only look for these testing entities, that they don't interact with anything that's in production. So one thing that we had was because we had all these Booleans, we had all these flags in production, because we knew which users were performing which actions, we knew which users were going to be performing which tests, which actions, and these users would automatically be excluded from all of our data and analytics, from all of our reporting. They would have their own separate bucket. So we would have in our looker charts, we would say, show me all the click events for this thing, but exclude all the test users. this would happen for like each feature. So we would have like a separate place where the data was for the testing users and the data was for the real users. Okay, so then in your automation scripts, you want to make sure that your test entities only interact with your test entities. So if you are doing like a checkout for an item on a retail application, so something that you can do is you can have a test user in production and then a test t-shirt in production and then a test shopping cart in production, and make sure that as you go through the flow that like only your test user interacts with this test t-shirt and this test shopping cart, and if it doesn't, then the test would fail. And I'll go through this setup and teardown process later, but each company in the world has their own testing entities that you have to figure out what those are and if you can flag them. If you can flag them and say this is a testing entity or this is a production entity. So we were able to create and manipulate these testing entities in production by having these specific predetermined guidelines. And this allowed us to make sure that what we were doing was not affecting real end users. Okay, so the next step is to write your tests. I really like to use BDD, just simple cucumber, gherkin, given, when, then. This process for me provides like a lot of clarity when something fails. So like given a precondition, when you do something in the test, then expect something to happen. So the terminology is really easy to understand, and when a test fails, you know exactly where it failed. But whether or not you use BDD, you want to make sure you have as much visibility again into your tests as possible. Okay, so let's talk about setup and teardown. So before every test that happens in production, you want to make sure you're starting from the right place. You want to make sure you clear your cookies, that you log in with the test user, that you're set up to start running the test properly. And then for the actual test, this is what we talked about before, where you go in and you perform any actions that you need to validate. And then in your teardown, you undo any actions that you perform during your test. So if you checked out that t-shirt, you know, in your teardown, you're going to go in and you're going to return that t-shirt to the merchandise. You're going to make sure that it's there again. Something that I see a lot when people are setting up tests, especially when they run tests in production, and it's really dangerous, their alerting tool is only set up to go off when the test fails, but not when the setup or teardown fails. And this causes problems because if your teardown fails and you didn't undo that action in production, then end users could see that action. It could affect real things that are happening. So you want to make sure that when you set up your alerting tool, it's set up for your setup, your test, and your teardown, so that anywhere in the testing process, if something goes wrong, you're alerted and you know what's going on. Cool. So something else I like to do is to deploy to a production canary. What's a production canary? For those of you who are not familiar with production canaries, it's when you slowly roll out a change to a small subset of users before you roll it out to your entire infrastructure. And what this does is it minimizes the impact if something goes wrong. So it's a way to provide risk mitigation. If for some reason you went through the feature flagging process and you didn't catch a bug and it was released into production, do you want 1% of your users to interact with that feature, or do you want 100% of your users to interact with that feature that has the bug? So using a production canary allows you to identify the issue, roll back to a good version, and then fix the issue in a controlled environment. So it's really having that safety net. And something to note is that infrastructure changes and configuration changes should be tested with canaries. So this is just like a rule of thumb for me. Anytime you make changes to your YAML files, to anything that has to do with your infrastructure, using a production canary is just a really great way to do that, so that you can make sure that these changes that you made didn't affect negatively. Okay, so while you're setting up your canary, you can allocate traffic to a certain subset of users that you want to be able to see that feature. So this is what it looks like in Split and Netlify. These are two tools that you can use for production canaries. And then what if something's wrong in your canary code? So what if you deployed a bug in the feature flagging process, and then you deployed it and you go into your You go into your production canary and you set your canary to 5% because you want 5% of your users to see this initially, and there's a bug for those 5%. What do? So the first thing that you have to do is just figure out what's going on, analyze the issue, and then ask yourself, is it okay if my users see this? Is it okay if my users interact with this bug? If it is okay, then I would keep the canary as is and fix the bug. If it's not okay, return the canary to 0% and then fix the bug. Okay, so for risk mitigation when you're testing in production, before launch, use feature flagging to target specific users, and then after launch, use a production canary to limit your audience. Okay, so the outcome of this process was really outstanding. So everyone on our team, from our product to our engineers to our designers to our VP to our CTO, everyone knew that our features were working in production before we ever launched. So we knew that they were working before we released, and that gave us so much confidence. We also had an increased developer velocity, so our developers spent much less time fixing bugs and more time creating features for our users. And the outcome of this is that when you're testing in production, you're being proactive rather than reactive. So I don't want to wait for something to go wrong and then have someone report it to me and then fix it. I want to figure out what's going on and fix it before the user ever sees anything wrong. And testing in production is a way to be proactive. It's a way to do this, to fix bugs and to provide the best possible user experience, because it's really shitty when you get a bug reported to you and you tested in staging and it was fine, but then in production, it's not working. So I don't want to wait until something breaks. I want to fix it ahead of time. Okay, so what would happen is our tests would fail. We would immediately get alerted. We would analyze the issue and resolve it as soon as possible. And this, again, it minimized our user interaction with bugs and defects, and it ensured a really great user experience. So just a note on performance testing in production. It is possible. I would do it at a time with low traffic. So usually this is like 2, 3 in the morning, and be prepared for outages, because it's better to do it on purpose and control the outcome rather than it happen to you unexpectedly when you have high traffic and it's more sensitive to fix the issue, right? Okay, so when you're testing in production with third parties, something that I really like to do is in the API request, I put a header saying that this is a test user. So all requests coming from this test user or anything with this header is going to be marked as test data. You can work with your third parties to identify these flags that you implemented. So if you have things like I'll use the checkout example again. So in that process, like let's say you send a confirmation email to the user, or you send a confirmation email to the person who accepts the order. If you do this in production and you check out a t-shirt, it's going to go to a few different places to process the order. Something you can do is in the API requests, mark those users as test users, like I said before, and then you can tell your third party, hey, everything with this header is going to be a test user. Like, don't process it, don't send the emails, don't do whatever you got to do. So using API request headers is a really great way to problem solve when you're dealing with third parties. Okay, so what if you can't test in production? What if you work for a bank, or you work for a hospital, or you work for some company or something where you really just cannot test in production? It's just not an option. You can't do it. What I would suggest is spinning up a containerized environment. So you can use Docker to spin up your microservices, but remember, the more dependencies, the more complicated this gets. One of the things that I've noticed with this approach is that it gets really expensive. So all the times that your developers will push up code, all the times that any code gets pushed up, if these tests run, if this environment pops up, it gets really expensive really fast. So just some things to note when you're testing in a containerized environment. You need to know which version of Docker will be used in production and test against those versions. You need to run separate tests for each individual microservice as well as all of them together. And the security of these containerized environments, I don't know if you guys have seen this online, but it's really not super safe because people are always trying to get into them. It's not super safe. And again, it's very expensive. So testing in a containerized environment, it's still good. It's still good, but just not as good as testing in production. Okay, so what about other non-production tests? So staging environments can still be used for pre-production testing. So I'm not saying tomorrow, kill your staging environment and just test in production. You can still use your staging environment for pre-production testing. And this comes in handy with things like SOX compliance, things that have to do with data and privacy that you just can't test those things in production. If you work for a bank, I used to work for a payment processing company, and we just couldn't test in production. So this could be one of those solutions. So like I said, privacy and data-related efforts, you can use your staging environment for those pre-production tests. So when we think about our production tests, when we think about end-to-end testing in production, it's in a bubble. It's, like I said in the beginning, those tests are not all of your tests. So if you think of all of your tests, inside that is your end-to-end flows, and inside that are your production tests. So again, not all end-to-end tests are production tests because of these data issues and privacy issues and things that are just out of your hands. Okay, let's talk about shifting your company's testing culture. If this is something that you wanted to do, I would start by explaining why the pros outweigh the cons for your company. So is your staging environment unreliable? And for all of you, that's true. Are there frequently issues that you think could have been caught if you were testing in production? Something that I like to do that really makes my points valid when I'm talking to management is use examples from the past. So, hey, do you remember when we tested this feature in and out in staging and then we deployed it to production and it caused this huge bug? Do you think that if we tested this in production that bug could have been caught? These are the questions that you should start to bring up to your management, to your leadership, to the people who make these decisions. And then propose a path forward. You can't just go to management with a problem. You have to go to them with a solution too. So something that you can ask is, have you heard about this thing called feature flagging? Do you think we can take some time in our next sprint to go over it and to see if we would benefit from it? If we were to start testing in production, which test do you think could bring us the most value? So we used to be scared of deploying new features. We used to have fights of whether or not to deploy code on Fridays. Now we don't fight about that. We fight about other things. And once we started moving more and more things to testing in production, this fear and these discussions stopped. So the lead time to know if something was wrong was reduced, and the confidence in our releases increased. And that's a really big plus when you're talking to senior level people. Okay. So there's always going to be those people who say testing in production will never work, right? Here's what I say to those people. Number one, staging will never fully represent production. Number two, staging is a sunk cost. And at the end of the day, those people, those naysayers, they're not my target audience. They can either get on board or die off. Not die off. Okay, so I just want to summarize. When you're testing in production, some of the things that are really important that you do. The first thing is install your tools. So your feature flagging, your automation, your job scheduler, your alerting tool. And then create your test data and make sure that your testing entities only interact with your testing entities. And then write your tests. So make sure that you get alerted for setup, testing, and teardown of the testing process. Launch your feature behind a feature flag, deploy to a production canary, and have a drink. Okay, so in case you weren't paying attention at all for the past 45 minutes, I want you to take away two things from this presentation. Number one, no one cares if your feature is working in staging. We care if it works in production. And number two, the only way to know if it's working in production is to test it in production. And thanks, guys. That's all.